Let me begin by saying good evening and welcome to this virtual public meeting that is the third public information center in support of the Paris Flood Risk Mitigation Study. And thank you so very much for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us. I know there's a lot of things that compete for your time and your attention and your interest in the study and of course in your neighborhoods, your businesses, and in the community and the county as a whole is much appreciated. Some of you have heard me say this before, but I think it bears repeating. I do a fair bit of this kind of work, and it's my personal belief that people who like yourselves, who take time out of your busy lives to contribute constructively to matters of civic and societal interest are always most deserving of our gratitude and respect. So thank you again for joining us, and I look forward, as I'm sure to you, to a productive session. Now, for those of you whom I've not yet met, my name is Glenn Pache. I'm the head of a firm called GLPI, and it's my pleasure to serve as the independent facilitator for this meeting. So again, it might be important for you to know that I am not an employee of the county, nor am I an employee of any of the environmental consultants that have been retained to assist with this flood risk mitigation initiative. The only bias I bring to the meeting, if you can call it a bias, is toward achieving the best result for us all, and that's what I will set out to do. Now, I'll introduce a couple of others in a few minutes, but first let's talk a bit about what it is that we are up to tonight. As you all might imagine, this study is important given that its outcomes will help to protect both public and private property that is at risk from flooding, but more importantly, to reduce risks to people's lives and to public health. And as you'll hear later, there is an identified strategy for doing this. In fact, building on all of the public outreach and community engagement done to date, tonight's meeting is focused on two or three key things. One is sharing a summary of the work that has been completed as part of the study. The other is sharing the preferred alternative for addressing the Paris flood risk issue. And lastly, we want to identify next steps and to conclude the environmental process, including any potential future companion initiatives. So in terms of our meeting agenda, it's very straightforward. We're obviously in the opening remarks component right now. I'll provide a bit of information about how you can participate in tonight's online meeting, and I'll cover a few housekeeping items in just a minute or two. I'll also in a moment invite Mayor David Bailey to share some words of welcome and context. We'll then have an overview presentation describing the purpose of the initiative, the work and analysis that's been completed, the preferred alternative, timelines, next steps, and so forth. But more than that, we're also inviting you to share your questions of fact or clarification and/or any comments. They can be put to our panel of experts a little bit later in the meeting, and more about how we'll do that in a few minutes. We'll look to address as many questions and comments as there is time for this evening, and to be respectful of your time, we're looking to wrap things up by no later than about 8 o'clock tonight. By the way, some people sent questions in advance of the meeting, and our speakers will try to address many of them during tonight's session. Please note that the team is not, and this is really important, I want to emphasize this, the team is not getting into or addressing any individual property or site-specific questions. Those are best dealt with through other means, including one-on-one conversations outside of this public forum. At the end of the Q&A panel, we'll talk about next steps and outline the range of opportunities outside of this session that are available for you or to you for providing comments and observations. And the county very much looks forward to the open sharing of information and of course appreciates value-adding comments that can result in the best steady outcome. So before we go on, a few words about the nature of this Zoom session. And I know that many of you are veterans of virtual meetings, you use Zoom all the time, but others may be using the Zoom platform for the first time tonight. So bear with me while I go through a few important points that you need to know. First of all, the session is being recorded, both so that there is a record of it, and also so that the content can be made available post-session on the county's website to those who are unable to join us this evening. Now, relating to the functionality of the webinar, as an attendee, you cannot be seen or heard by us or by anyone else participating. The way you can participate is by sending your questions or comments that you'd like us to put to our panel by using the live Q&A icon on the panel at the bottom of your device. So you may have to take your cursor and hover over it. You should see the Q&A icon again at the bottom of your device. And it may be in a slightly different place depending on whether you're using the program, the app, and so forth, and whether you're using a laptop, a tablet, or a smartphone. But again, that is your way to engage with us during this virtual meeting. So during the Zoom session, questions and comments can only be submitted by using the Q&A function. And county staff will be reviewing those questions and comments. They will be queuing them to be put to our responder panel during the question and answer part of the webinar. And by the way, again, if you're new to Zoom, you can adjust the size of the presentation screen and the speaker screen by sliding the toggle to the left or the right. And again, you just have to use your cursor to go on top of the toggle. And then you should be able to, again, move it to the right or to the left. If you encounter any significant technical issues, write to us using the Q&A icon. But if one of your issues is that you're unable to do that, if you're having a problem with the Q&A, you can also email gary.porter@brant.ca. So again, that's Gary, G-A-R-Y, .porter, P-O-R-T-E-R, @brant.ca. And one of our technical experts will try to assist you. Now, for those of you who may have chosen to dial into the meeting, in other words, you are using a simple phone, so not a computer or smart or web-enabled device, you'll be able to listen to the discussion, but not share any questions or comments. So again, if you have any questions or comments about what's in the upcoming presentation, or maybe not in there, but that's relevant to our topic of the Paris Flood Risk Mitigation Study, please forward them as they occur to you. Don't wait till the end of the presentation. Send them as they occur to you through the Zoom Q&A function. That's really important. And if due to time constraints, your question is not addressed this evening, please be assured that it will be considered in staff documentation of questions and comments, and a summary of the questions and responses will be posted on the county's website. Now, just before I invite Mayor Bailey to share a few words of welcome and context, let me take a moment to very quickly introduce the panelists that you'll be hearing from or potentially hearing from this evening, depending on the nature of your questions. And I'll invite them to say a quick hello so that you can put a face to the name. And again, we have a number of county staff, but I'll just introduce three key ones for now. Let me start with Rob Walton, who is the General Manager of Operations. Rob?
Hi, everyone.
Thank you. And we have Clint Brown, who's a Public Works Technologist. Clint?
Good evening, everyone.
And we have Mark Maxwell, who is a Project Engineer. Mark?
Hi, everyone.
And from a firm called Ecosystem Recovery that is assisting the county with this initiative. Again, we have a number of individuals. I'll just introduce two of them. We have Chris Moon, who is a Senior Water Resources Engineer. Chris?
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the meeting.
Thank you. And we have Alana Vandersloos, who is a Water Resources Engineering Professional. Alana?
Good evening, everyone.
And of course, we have all of you without whom the meeting wouldn't make much sense. And I also understand that we have some of our other esteemed elected officials joining us, and possibly as well Michael Bradley, the Chief Administrative Officer or CAO with the county. I know they're all very interested in our topic. It's great to have you join us as well. But before we go any further, let me invite Mayor Bailey to share some words of welcome. Go ahead, sir.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you, Glenn, very much for being with us tonight. It's a very important topic, obviously, to the County of Brant. When you're nestled between two rivers, you always have to be aware of the situation. And when you start building buildings on places that people hear as floodplains, and the new people coming to the county, and maybe more specifically to Paris, might wonder why we would allow buildings to be on dangerous or what they perceive to be dangerous areas or lots of land. So it's very interesting to people that are just moving to the county. And I think it's just reaffirming that we have a plan. When you deal with rivers, you need to have a plan, because rivers don't really listen to council directives very well. They do what they do. But it's nice to see all the people from Public Works here. We have a very reliable staff in Public Works, very educated. I don't know who's here from council. Obviously, I bring greetings from the entire council. If you are here from council, you might want to just put in the Q&A your name and just let us know that you're here. I'm sure the 4 Paris councilors are here, and maybe some others, and probably Michael Bradley too. So if you want us to all know that you're here, just put your name up in the Q&A and we'll know. Again, Glenn, thank you I feel like we're in good hands tonight. You've done it a couple of times for us, and I certainly have no concerns with you being at the helm tonight. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayor Bailey. I appreciate that. So I'm going to invite Rob to say just a few words before we introduce the video presentation, which is our next topic on the agenda. So Rob, I know you wanted to say a couple of things, and then if you want to hand it back to me, I'll move us into the video presentation.
Thanks, Glenn. I don't really have a lot to say. The next portion of the meeting will be a PowerPoint presentation, and Alana is going to take us through that PowerPoint presentation. So back to you, Glenn.
Oh, that was it? Sorry, I thought you had a little more.
That's
That's great. I was basically going to say the same thing. So just for everybody's benefit, this is a pre-recorded video. It's also been up on the county's website, so some of you may have already had an opportunity to view it. It is the same one that is up, and it'll run for about 20 minutes or so. And again, you'll be hearing from Alana Vandersluis, who is again from Ecosystem Recovery, the firm working with the county. And I'll encourage everybody one more time, as questions occur to you, please do send them in using the Q&A function. The team will be looking at those, and we'll look to consolidate like questions and pose them to the team members after the presentation. So let's begin with the pre-recorded piece that will run now, and I'll invite our technical team to please play the presentation video.
Welcome to the 3rd Public Information Center, or PIC, for the Paris Flood Risk Mitigation Municipal Class Environmental Assessment. The purpose of this information center is to present the recommended preferred alternative, provide a summary of work completed throughout the project, describe the process that was followed for the class environmental assessment study, summarize feedback received to date and how it has been or will be addressed, and provide information on next steps to conclude the Class EA process. Study purpose. The purpose of the Class EA study was to review alternatives to further mitigate flood risks in Paris. Existing Paris flood protection works were completed in 1979 and are in need of maintenance and enhancements. There are existing public and private assets that need to be protected, along with a risk to public safety that must be mitigated. Why now? A condition assessment was completed in April 2019. This investigation found that the flood protection works are in need of significant maintenance. The use of updated modeling techniques has found that the level of protection currently in place does not meet the current standards. The Municipal Class Environmental Assessment, or MCEA process. This project has followed and complied with the MCEA process, which is a standard and accepted procedure for these types of projects. Following the MCEA process ensures adequate opportunity for public and stakeholder involvement and ensures all reasonable alternatives are considered. This slide summarizes communication and consultation efforts to date. On June 26, 2019, the Notice of Commencement and PIC number 1 was distributed. On July 11, 2019, PIC number 1 was held. On December 18, 2019, the Notice of PIC number 2 was distributed, and on January 14, 2020, PIC number 2 was held. Direct landowner consultations occurred in June 2020, including hand-delivered letters, site visits, and email correspondence with residents impacted by the N1 project location. Direct landowner consultation also occurred in September 2020, including letters to all directly impacted residents, site visits and meetings with various property owners, email and phone correspondence, and a Brant County media release. The Notice of PIC number 3 was distributed in early June in preparation for PIC number 3 on June 21, 2021. Throughout the project duration, the Brant County website has included project information and posts regular updates. Project notices were hand-delivered, with the exception of PIC number 3, and all public meetings were advertised in local newspapers and on social media. And impacted First Nations and agencies have been consulted. This slide contains some photos of historical flooding events in the town of Paris to provide some context for this project. The top left photo shows the high level of the Grand River under the William Street Bridge in downtown Paris during the flood of May 1974. The top middle photo shows the high water during the 1947 flood. The top right photo shows the back of the Grand River Street shops in 1912. The bottom left photo shows the intersection of Mechanic Street and West River Street during the flood of 1947. In the bottom middle photo, volunteers placed sandbags along the Grand River during the flood of May 1974. And in the bottom right photo, there's a view of the floodwaters looking towards a home on Elm Street, with the William Street Bridge in the background in 1912. This slide shows some photos of the January 1979 Ice Jam flood event. This slide shows some photos of the March 1979 Ice Jam flood event. Floodwater affected residents of Willow and Elm Streets in Paris. What is a flood return period? A return period represents the statistical likelihood or probability of an event occurring in any given year. For example, a 100-year return period event has a 1% probability, or 1 in 100, of occurring in any given year, regardless of what happened in the previous year. Similarly, a 10-year event has a 10%, or 1 in 10, probability of occurring in any given year. In other words, it is possible, but unlikely, to have two separate 100-year events occur in the same year or in successive years. The existing flood protection works in Paris generally do not meet current standards. If there is flooding on the Nith River and the Grand River is also high, the current protection is at a 5-year level. If there's flooding on the Grand River and the Nith River is at a normal level, the current protection is at the 100-year level. If there's flooding on the Grand River and the Nith River is also high, the current protection is between a 50 to 100-year level. The existing flood protection works are shown on this map. In GE1, there is an earthen dike and gabion wall with an earth core. GE2 and GE3 consist of an earthen dike. GE4 and most of GE5 consist of a vertical gabion wall, and the south end of GE5 currently has no flood protection works. GW1 is high ground and has no flood protection. GW2 consists of riverside buildings and has no flood protection works. N1 consists of an earthen dike and gabion walls. N2 has sections with gabion basket toe protection and earthen dike. This slide outlines some of the work and studies that have been completed thus far. The work completed for the condition assessment in 2018 included a geotechnical assessment, stability analysis, and building foundation inspections of the downtown Riverside buildings. The technical studies completed for the municipal class environmental assessment from 2019 to 2021 include hydraulic modeling to establish flood risk under various scenarios, natural heritage investigations completed to determine the potential for impact to the environment under various options. This included aquatic habitat, ecological land classification, a flora and fauna inventory, breeding bird surveys, and a tree inventory. A cultural heritage assessment that includes a review of existing research, a site visit, evaluation of heritage value, and a report. An archaeological assessment to determine the potential for impacts to archaeological resources. An interior drainage assessment to evaluate the potential for flooding due to water being trapped behind the dikes. A flood damages assessment to estimate damages for a variety of flood events for each alternative design scenario. And an emergency management plan that includes roles, responsibilities, actions, and management arrangements for emergency operations to ensure a coordinated response. The potential solutions that were evaluated throughout this project are as follows. Solution 1 was to do nothing. This includes no improvements or changes to the current flood protection and leads to further deterioration and potential failure of the flood protection works. Solution 2 was to undertake maintenance and repair activities to maintain the current location and height of flood protection works. This involves removing or relocating trees and overgrown vegetation on flood protection works, repairing flood protection to address localized failures, and reconstructing the flood protection works that currently have a stability factor of less than 1. Solution 3 was to increase the level of protection to the 100-year flood level. This would involve reconstructing and raising the flood protection works to the 100-year flood elevation plus a 0.3 meter freeboard to account for climate change impacts. Trees and overgrown vegetation on the flood protection works would be removed or relocated, and flood protection works with a stability factor of less than 1 would be reconstructed and raised. Solution 4 was to increase the level of protection to the regulatory, or approximately 500-year flood level. This would involve reconstructing and raising the flood protection works to the regulatory flood level plus a 0.3 meter freeboard to account for climate change impacts. Trees and overgrown vegetation on the flood protection works would be removed or relocated, and flood protection works with a stability factor of less than 1 would be reconstructed and raised. The selected preferred alternative was Solution 3. A range of feedback was received throughout the project. Some feedback received in support of the project included raising flood protection measures will protect personal property as well as the Paris downtown area, confidence in the process and the proposed solution, an apt and prudent step for the continued economic success of the County of Brant, general support for proposed improvements, and this is needed in order to protect important heritage buildings in Paris. Some suggestions received included accessible pathways along the river should not be on private property, Existing paths on private lands should be closed and opportunities to install privacy screens explored. More detail was requested regarding the concept sketches, and an opportunity to integrate a path along the rear of downtown Riverside buildings. Some questions that were asked included: flood protection has not been required in the past. Why do we need increased flood protection now? Is tree removal necessary? What will be the impact on Riverside buildings? What will be the impact on businesses and tourism? Will flood elevations increase as a result of the flood protection works? How can the community be more involved or consulted with? Would a flood protection wall along the Riverside buildings have a negative aesthetic? What are the details of the easements? This slide outlines how we have considered and incorporated feedback that was received. Firstly, why do we need this project? Paris Downtown and the Flats are located within the floodplain of the Grand River and Nith River, and as such are vulnerable to flooding. The consequences of that flood risk must be understood and mitigated as appropriate. Why do we need this project now? A condition assessment identified concerns with respect to the level of flood protection provided by the existing flood protection works, along with stability and maintenance concerns. Funding is available through various provincial and federal grants. What will be the impact of flood protection on downtown and Riverside buildings in section GW2? It is recommended that the GW2 Riverside buildings be carried forward as a Schedule C environmental assessment, which allows for additional research and consultation. This will include development of alternative designs for the preferred solution, including location, function, and aesthetics, consideration of enhancement with a path, identification and evaluation of impacts, flood, natural heritage, and structural, and additional consultation. Is tree loss necessary? A natural heritage investigation has been completed, which recommends mitigation and compensation strategies for trees that must be removed during construction. What are the details regarding the easements? This will be negotiated between the county and the landowner during the detailed design after completion of this environmental assessment. Public access through private property should not be encouraged. There will be no public access proposed through private residential properties as part of the preferred solution. Inadequate consultation efforts. The county will continue to consult by posting project updates online, distributing letters, and posting ads in newspapers as necessary. A master plan report will be made available for review. The following series of slides show a preliminary design of the improvement works specific to each section of flood protection works. The location is highlighted in red at the top corner of each slide. It is important to keep in mind that these designs are preliminary and are subject to changes during the detailed design phase, which is not part of this environmental assessment. GE1 is located along Willow Street from the railway bridge to Penman's Dam on the east bank of the Grand River. In GE1, it is proposed to flatten the slope of the riverbank to a maximum of 1.5 to 1 with rock erosion protection and include a concrete sidewalk and pedestrian guardrail adjacent to Willow Street. GE2 is located south of GE1 on the east bank of the Grand River from Penman's Dam to the William Street Bridge. In GE2, it is proposed to maintain the existing 2-to-1 slopes with rock erosion protection and implement privacy screen plantings on the inside slope of the dike. The existing vegetation is to remain on the riverbanks. GE3 is located south of GE2 on the east bank of the Grand River, south of William Street. The proposed design for the upper section of GE3 is to regrade the slopes to 2.5 to 1 and maintain the existing vegetation on the riverbank, as well as plant privacy screen vegetation on the existing property. In the lower section of GE3, which is adjacent to the baseball diamond at the Sill Apps Community Center, it is proposed to raise the flood protection works slightly and maintain the slopes of 2:1. The existing vegetation at the toe of the slope will remain. GE4 is located south of GE3 on the east bank of the Grand River at the residential development at 80 Willow Street. At GE4, the proposed solution is to replace the existing retaining wall with a new concrete cantilever wall. GE5 is located south of GE4 on the east bank of the Grand River, behind the existing residential properties on Willow Street. The preferred solution for the upper portion of GE5 is to replace the existing retaining wall with a new concrete cantilever wall to protect the existing dwellings. The lower portion of GE5 is located just north of the Dundas Street Bridge on the east side of the Grand River. This land is currently being developed by Kayak Urban Townhomes, and there are no works proposed at this location. GW1 is located on the west bank of the Grand River, from the railway bridge south to the William Street Bridge. There are no works proposed at GW1. GW2 is located on the west bank of the Grand River, from the William Street Bridge to the Grand River Street Bridge, and contains the Riverside Building foundations in downtown Paris. It is recommended that the GW2 section be carried forward as a Schedule C environmental assessment. Design alternatives will consider existing balconies, windows, and foundation walls. N1 is located on the north and east banks of the Nith River. The first section extends west from the Grand River Street Bridge. The proposed solution for the lower part of N1 is to raise the dike while protecting the existing vegetation on the riverbanks. The preferred solution for the middle part of N1 is to replace the existing gabion wall with a lock block retaining wall to protect the residential properties at this location. The preferred solution at the upper part of N1 is to implement either an armorstone wall or an earthen dike to protect the adjacent residential properties. Additional consultation with homeowners will be completed during detailed design to determine the favored treatment. This slide outlines a potential implementation plan and priority list of sections. This plan is pending ongoing condition assessments and funding availability, and the prioritization list is subject to change. Each dike section was rated according to the following criteria: condition rating, which reflects observable existing problems such as slope failures, soil movement, erosion, and hazard vegetation; stability. An analysis was conducted using geotechnical software based on geometry, soil strength parameters, pore water pressure conditions, soil structure interface, and loading on the structure. Flood protection. This factor indicates whether the section provides flood protection to a greater area. And impact, which is a multiplier that indicates the amount of benefit that results from reconstruction of a dike section. The following list shows a potential implementation schedule based on the prioritization score of each section. Please note that this list is subject to change. N1B in 2022, N1A in 2023, GW2 in 2024, GE3 in 2025, GE5 in 2026, GE1 in 2027, GE2 in 2028, N2A in 2029, and GE4 in 2030. GW1 and N2B do not require work at this time. The next steps for this project are as follows. Complete and file the project report for the Paris Flood Risk Mitigation Environmental Assessment for public comment. Results of the EA is that the preferred alternative is to raise the level of flood protection to the 100-year flood level plus 0.3 meter freeboard in Paris. For sections GW1, N2-1, and GE5-2, no works are proposed. For sections GE1, GE2, GE3, GE4, GE5-2, N1, and N2-2, the requirements of the Schedule B process have been fulfilled. And section GW2, the Riverside buildings, is to follow a Schedule C process. Complete the Schedule C environmental assessment for GW2, pending support and cooperation from stakeholders, as well as funding for the project to move forward. Detailed design and construction, which is not part of this project. A multi-phased approach with potential Phase 1 construction in 2022, pending funding availability and scope of work. Starting with the most critical section according to the prioritization strategy outlined in the EA report. Funding will be applied for and obtained prior to construction. Thank you for participating in our online Public Information Center for the Paris Flood Risk Mitigation Municipal Class Environmental Assessment. Please visit the Engage Brant website at engagebrant.ca to provide comments. Should you have any questions or concerns, please contact either of the following people: Chris Moon, P.Eng., Senior Project Manager at Ecosystem Recovery, Inc., at 171 Victoria Street North in Kitchener, Ontario, N2H5C5, by phone at 519-621-1500, or by email at chris.moon@ecosystemrecovery.ca. Or Clint Brown, Public Works Technologist at the County of Brant, at 26 Park Avenue, Burford, Ontario, N0E1A0, by phone at 519-449-2451, or by email at publicworks@brant.ca.
Okay, thank you for the informative presentation, and thank you again to everyone for participating in tonight's session, both for your interest in the topic and for the questions that have already been provided either in advance of the meeting. And again, a number of people did send questions in advance, and also those have been provided sort of live and in real time. I'll just note that the mayor had invited some of his esteemed colleagues to let us know if they had joined us. And I'm aware of at least 3. There may be more, but I just wanted to say a quick hello to Councillors Pierce, Bell, and Howes, who I know are part of the meeting tonight. And again, there may be others who have joined us in progress. And somebody had asked, how many attendees do we have in the meeting? We've got about 30 at the moment, excluding the panelists, that is the project team members who will be part of the responder panel. So we've got about 30 or so people at the moment. So again, for those of you who may have joined us in progress, you had just been listening to an overview presentation by the study team. My name is Glenn Pache. I have the privilege of serving as the independent facilitator for tonight's meeting. Let's move to your questions and comments now. As the questions have been submitted, staff have been reviewing them to identify those that are similar in nature and with a view to addressing duplication. And in some cases, they've been consolidating multiple questions into a single one. So please don't worry if the question isn't asked exactly as you may have posed it. Again, there's been some consolidation to try to make sure that we get through as much as possible. And again, if we don't get to all of the questions this evening, and I know some of them are or have been of a site-specific nature, and those we are not dealing with in this public forum, county staff have committed again to reviewing all of the questions and to documenting them as part of the input to the initiative, and a summary of the Q&As will be posted to the county's website. So let's get to the questions and answers. And I'm going to start with one, and I'll invite the folks from the county to jump in. There have been a number of questions about how people have been notified and consulted. So someone is wondering, how have people been notified about this meeting and about earlier meetings as part of the process? And what has the county done to make people aware of not only the meetings, but the project as a whole? And I gather that underlying that is a sense that there's been some inadequate outreach. But who from the county would like to jump in and give us an overview of how people have been contacted, notified, and so forth as part of the process? Rob, did you want to jump in? Or
Clint, I think Clint Brown's going to answer that.
Yeah, that's I thought. Clint, if you could unmute, please.
So we had initially sent out flyers, hand delivered, over 500 flyers in the floodplain area, as well as we've had PICs 1 and 2 to date that were both posted in the Expositor and other local newspapers.
And were there any mailings or drops to businesses or anything of that nature to notify them?
Yes, at the beginning of the project, there were 500 notices hand delivered to residents and businesses in the floodplain.
Okay, thanks, Clint. Someone is also asking, it starts with a comment, we've been getting by just fine with the way things are now. Why are we proposing all of these changes for flood events, given that they are rare and infrequent? Who would like to tackle that one? Is that a Chris Moon question?
Hi, Glenn. Yeah, I can respond to that. So to paraphrase the question again, Glenn, so it was, we've been doing just fine right up until now. Why are we dealing with this now? I think it's I guess a two-part answer to that question. One, we've been lucky, and I think there was a question in the chat that said, why hasn't it flooded since 1979 when the works were last sort of looked at, maintained, and enhanced? Well, partly, they've provided some protection, so we've benefited from those works up until now, but we also haven't seen a 100-year flood event since 1979 or even before that. And it can go for many years. It could go for 100 years and we don't get a 100-year event at all, but the probability is that it could occur. It could occur twice in 1 year, as it happened in Peterborough. So, we've been lucky up until now. How long will that luck last? We're not really in the game of gambling, so we're looking to take the next move and raise the level of protection to the 100-year. So that's kind of the first part of it. The second part is, we've completed the condition assessment and found the existing works are, while they've served us well, they will not continue to serve us well unless some maintenance and enhancements are done to them. Just like replacing the shingles on your roof, you can't just forget about them. They won't last forever. So, and I guess the third part of that is there's some impetus and funding as well to support the investigations and the implementation.
Rob, did you want to jump in? It looked like you had something to add. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I'll add that in February 2018, there actually was a flood event caused by ice, which in Paris came very close to overtopping the flood protection, and Brantford actually did. And with ice, it's very hard to predict what will happen and what the flows need to be to actually put it forward jam and actually go over the top. So, yeah, I think that we have seen near misses, and we need to have a look at what we have, what the condition of it is, and what we need to have going forward. Because the condition of it that it is today, unless we do something, there will be eventually problems even with what's there today. So, thanks, Glenn.
Thank you. And Chris, let me go back to the question that you referenced earlier. You were talking about somebody who had asked, you know, why do you think hasn't been significant flooding since 1979? They went on to say, do you think it is a result of engineered controls and increased understanding of water management, or have we just been lucky? So any thoughts about the latter part of that question?
We've been lucky.
So it's not the engineered controls, it's not the other factors, it is just a matter of luck?
That's correct. So the modeling that was completed as part of this current study shows that if the 1 in 100 year storm event did occur, it would overtop, even a more frequent event than the 100 year would overtop that existing flood protection system and cause damages.
And Chris, you might be the best guy to respond to this next one as well, but people are wondering, when will they have access to the hydraulic modeling and the geotechnical analysis? So I guess they're eager to go through some of that data and information. When will it be publicly available?
So at the completion of the PIC and any follow-up correspondence that will be had with interested parties, there'll be a project file report that's collated and put out for public review for 30 days. So, you know, as quickly as we can get that out on the street, then they'll have the opportunity to see that. And that will contain the results of the hydraulic modeling. It'll also contain the geotechnical reporting.
Now, I know some of you on the project team have been at this for years, but some of the public are wondering about the timing, and more specifically, they're asking, why are the changes being proposed now? And what's the urgency? Why can't all of this wait another 10, 20, 30 years or beyond? So what's underlying the need for doing something, you know, sooner than later?
I think it goes back to the answer to the earlier question, Glenn. It's we have the information now. We are aware that, you know, the flood protection doesn't meet the current standard. You know, we've had the funding to complete these investigations and make recommendations, and puts the county in the position to apply for more funding to do the implementation. So, you know, that's a large part of why we would do this now, because, you know, we need to address that flood risk that we're aware of.
And again, I don't know if this next question goes to you, Chris, or perhaps to some of our staff from the county, but somebody's wondering, how does a person register either their support or their opposition to what's being proposed? And more specifically, some are wondering what the time constraint is. When and how long do property owners have to get their say before you proceed with setting the plans, you know, somewhat in stone, if I can put it that way? So who's up on that one? How do people register their support or their opposition? And what are the timelines for expressing their views before things get locked in?
Well, I think either Clint or myself, like, people can email us or reach out to us. I think our contact details are at the end of the presentation there. So, you know, we're very happy to receive comments, support, or questions and concerns. You know, the timeline. So once we've considered that feedback and we've incorporated it as appropriate, it'll go into that project file report, which will be screened for 30 days. So there's another 30-day period of time where you know, everyone has an opportunity to comment and put their input in. And then once those 30 days are done, and it will go to I mean, Rob, maybe this is a question you can answer a little bit better, but it will go to council, I believe. Is that correct, for acceptance?
Yes, Chris. When the report is done, we will take a staff report to council, which this would be attached to it, and ask council to adopt the project and set the public review period. And just to answer the question about how long we would take comments after, generally we have a period of about 2 weeks where we will accept comments at the end of a public information center before we finalize the report. So I don't know, do we have formal comment forms for this meeting, or is it just emails that we're accepting?
We don't have a formal comment form. I see emails.
Okay.
So Chris, somebody's put forward an alternative, and I guess they'd like to get your response to it. They're asking, why can't the river basin be dredged to the shale base as has been done in previous years? Is that not a potential solution to the flood risk issues?
I know that was a recommendation of the Royal Commission, I believe, in the 70s. And it was never implemented at that point in time along the Grand. The record shows that while it was considered as an option, it was never actually implemented, and that was back in the 70s. Even more so now, like to go in and dredge the Grand River and the Nith River and create, you know, an environmental hazard around that would be an extremely difficult thing to get through an approval process, and agencies would very much be against that. And then even that aside, the benefits of the dredging, you know, may be limited, because when you look at how a river behaves hydraulically, the controls may not be the depth of that channel, the conveyance capacity of that channel. For example, in the Nith River, when the Grand River is high, the water has nowhere to go. So deepening that channel would be likely provide little benefit to the flood elevations coming back up the Nith.
Thanks, Chris. And this one might go to you or to your colleague, Jeff. I'm not sure who's better positioned to answer it, but somebody would like more detail about the impact criteria. You know, what are they specifically? How are they measured, and so forth? So can you give us greater detail about that? And again, Jeff and or Chris, if one of you wants to kick us off, that would be terrific.
I can take a stab at. I'm interpreting the question a little bit to be how we're evaluating the specific alternatives based on the EA process, on the environmental assessment process. And typically we look at the natural heritage pieces. We look at impacts to aquatic and terrestrial species. We look at species at risk. We look at the technical pieces, the design of it, the construction or constructability, the operation and maintenance outcomes of the proposed alternatives. We look at the social and economic pieces, which is public health and safety, archaeological impacts, property impacts, aesthetics, indigenous communities are in their planning. And then usually at the end, there's always a financial and an economic component that's really looking at the cost of implementation or the cost of not implementing. In this case, there was a lot of work done on the flood damages side where we were looking at the impacts of flooding at different return periods and the costs associated with them, and trying to balance the cost of implementing some of these alternatives. And then through that process, it's a very elaborate evaluation matrix that's included in the documentation for the study. The outcome in this case, you know, is the selection of a preferred alternative based on the weighting of categories and the evaluation made by the study team at the time.
So Jeff and maybe Chris, I think this question would go to either or both of you. People are wondering about the need and justification for all of this. So they're saying, what evidence is there that the riverbank cages or the other flood protection measures are deteriorating? What's the proof of the need and justification for going ahead with this whole thing? So what have you found in the study that can shed some light on those questions?
Oh, from a condition assessment standpoint, you know, there are wire baskets that have rusted out, and the stones have fallen out into the river and, you know, made them structurally unstable. You know, that's observable by anybody who wants to stand on William Street Bridge or on the south bank of the Nith. You can see that where that's failed, and that's going to continue on. They have a limited lifespan before they fail. So, you know, the condition, the evidence is there for everyone to see. the structural stability component. So there was boreholes completed. There was materials testing done for the structural components of the soils that was found, and then modeling to determine the strength and the properties and the stability of the dikes based on those properties of the soil. So that there's a very clear science-based analysis that's determined what the factor of safety is from the dikes based on their geometry and materials. And that's come out telling us that there is a concern there that needs to be addressed. And then again, from the flooding standpoint, we know that the dikes were implemented back in the 70s or even earlier, the 50s, or even earlier than that, as the change of land use happened within Paris. And the technology and the ability to represent the hydraulic behavior that's quite complex at the confluence of the two rivers. We've improved that through the years, and we've been able to, confidently model that now and confirm what we suspected, and what the GRCA had suspected was the weak point within that flood protection system being, the interaction of the Grand and the Nith backing up and going over at Mechanic Street Bridge and then flooding downtown. So, we've built this sort of layer upon layer of, justification for the works. And then once the flood protection is breached, and we do have those high levels in there, it's the associated damages with them. So it becomes, a calculation against, money invested in capital infrastructure versus damages avoided. And that's how we've laid out the justification within the criteria that Jeff just spoke to for the evaluation.
Thanks, Chris. Jeff, anything you'd like to add, or?
No, I mean, Chris did a great job of summing it up. The precursor, there are two precursors to this environmental assessment, and both looking at the history of the implementation of the dike and the protection system in Paris, and that the original study, which identified or recommended, I guess, the need to do a more in-depth study as to what level of protection the existing infrastructure was providing. That study was where we did very detailed geotechnical modeling related to the factors of safety around the earth dikes and the retaining wall systems that are protecting the downtown and the flats. And through that study, the recommendation came to do this EA work, which really identified the areas that we've talked about that lack kind of the current standard. And then this team has looked at, basically all the options, or many of the options to mitigate that and to balance the costs and the risks associated with not doing anything.
So someone or a group of people have asked if the team could speak more about GW2 and the timeline that is associated with it and that will be followed. And more specifically, they have said, can you say what potential solutions might be brought forward? They've gone on to say it looks like the 100-year flood is above the level of Grand River Street North and above the level of the typical ground floor of buildings on the riverside. And they want to know, is that correct? And if so, what are the potential consequences? Chris, are you the guy to kick us off on that one?
I can answer portions of that question. We might break it up. There's I think there were 6 questions in there, Glenn. So the Grand River 100-year elevation plus freeboard is above a number of those ground floor building elevations, and it's above the Grand River what's the street behind the buildings. It's also above that as well. So that was the first. What were the remaining parts? I lost the train of thought there, Glenn. Come back to me with the question again.
Yeah, I will. But Jeff, I think you wanted to add something. Go ahead.
I was just going to help Chris out. The Grand River Street North is the name of the street, and the 100-year flood elevation is above that.
So they were interested, Chris, in knowing the timelines associated with GW2. They were also interested in confirming, whether they were interpreting the data correctly. And they were also interested in knowing what the consequences would be of that level of flooding.
So they are interpreting the data correctly. The timing, so given the interest in GW2 and the potential scope and extent of a project that could come out of that GW2 reach, the recommendation of the master plan is to bump that up to a Schedule C EA, which means that it follows another process of additional technical studies and development of alternatives to meet the preferred solution. So, at this time, I don't think we have an answer for what those solutions may be yet. We're deferring that, understanding that everyone's looking for more detail for that section, and we want to provide that detail in good time. But we don't want to prejudice what that EA or Schedule C EA process might find.
And I guess this is a related question, and tell me if you feel it's been dealt with already, but some people were concerned that the proposed changes would, quote, ruin the aesthetics of Paris, and also the unique views that make Paris such a charming tourist destination. Will that be dealt with as part of that Schedule C EA you just mentioned?
That's correct, man.
Okay, thank you. And then somebody is also asking, can or will a written timeline of the phases be provided? Chris, is that something you can speak to?
Sure. So there's a general implementation phasing that was included on one of the slides. It shows it going out over the next 10 to 12 years based on the priority ranking from a flood protection and impact avoidance and implementation ranking. The actual timing of when that may occur is somewhat flexible or subject to change. It will rely on funding being available for it to occur. And it may also shuffle around depending whether or not, one particular reach that seems to be in good condition now, let's say a basket lets go and a portion of one of those walls fails over on GW on the east bank of the Grand. If one of those fail, we want to bring that higher up. So it's a little bit flexible, but we've shown a 10 to 15 year implementation phase, which may even carry out over the next 10 to 20 years. There's a lot of variability within that.
There's a few questions about paths, and one of them is somebody is saying, I noticed that the previously proposed asphalt path has been removed from at least some of the N1 looks like -3 section. Can you confirm that? So let's start with that one. Is that in fact the case?
That's correct. And that's something that came up through the consultation after PIC number 2. So there was to every landowner that was impacted directly, there was a letter issued to them offering them to meet and outlining the project. And we met with a number of residents at that time, and there was a consistent feedback saying that, we don't want to encourage public access or perceived public access through private property by putting in an asphalt path, which is a very fair comment, and that was never the intent of that path. The intent of the path was originally to provide maintenance access. So if the county ever needed to get in there and do repairs or upgrades to it, they had a sturdy, workable surface that a machine could come through on. So we've taken that visual aesthetic away, and we'll make sure that the structure underneath, whether that's through a buried gravel path that can be turfed over or vegetated in some way, so that there's not a visual appearance of a path. And that's happened across all of those private properties. N1, I think GE3 as well.
So let me follow up. I mentioned there were a few questions about PASS, and you may have covered it, but I just want to make sure that we're not excluding this one. Somebody has asked how you will ensure that proposed paths along the river don't become public safety and security risks or nuisances, you know, that they'll lead to excess noise, to disruption, to people looking into their yards and so forth. Can you, have you got rid of all of the paths, did you say? Do you want to speak to that again, Chris?
Where it's through private property, yes, we're not showing any paths. So I think the term paths is probably incorrect. It'd be maintenance access for the county only. So that's the intent of what is shown on the dikes now. And then where there is a risk, I'm thinking of, you know, if there is a risk where there's the potential for people's privacy to be impacted, we've shown some additional screening planting can be implemented, and that's on some of those sections now as well. Future screening.
Okay. And some people are asking about endangered species or species at risk, whether they're snakes or, you know, other reptiles, animals of one kind or another. Are there any that would be affected by the proposed changes that you're putting forward in terms of flood control measures and mitigation? And if so, how would they be addressed? And more specifically, someone has said, just to combine a couple of questions, you know, that there are snakes living in some of the cages which are on the list of endangered species. So can you speak to that issue?
Yeah, so unfortunately, there is the potential for an environmental impact, and that has been considered. So there's an environmental impact study that is part of the project file, which will be included in that project file report for everyone to take a look at. So there's been a screening exercise and field visits to determine what species are living there, potential for species at risk, and you know whether or not they'd be impacted by the preferred alternatives. So where we do need to take out, say, vegetation or work in and around the water, there's restrictions around when you can do that to minimize that impact, around breeding birds or fish spawning periods. So we wouldn't be undertaking vegetation clearing during a time when it would have that impact on the birds or bats. So there's various mitigation measures to reduce the impact, and then there's also compensation. So where, you know, a number of trees will need to be removed if the project moves forward, those trees will be replaced at a higher ratio than what they're lost as part of compensation. I think, and then to speak to the snakes, that's probably correct. You know, there's potential for snakes to be living in those gabion stones. So I think it will come back to timing and care around how those contracts are prepared and what the contractors need to do when they encounter snakes and deal with them in an appropriate manner.
So Chris, somebody's asking, is it true that you plan to raise the riverbank in places by 6 feet, or, you know, roughly 2 meters or so? And is that really necessary? And have you considered the negative impacts that would have on adjacent properties and the property owners?
There are locations where the existing flood protection is quite low. And there will be the need to raise potentially up to 6 feet. So that is correct. You know, the impact, unfortunately, on any homeowners or residents in that area, you know, will need to be considered as best as possible. How that looks, whether or not the treatment on the rear side of the dike or wall, whether it's sloped, whether it's armor stone, whether it's stepped and terraced, how that is configured is all subject to detailed design, and can be worked within options and hopefully to minimize that aesthetic and that impact to the extent possible. But, you know, unfortunately, there may be some impacts that cannot be avoided.
And to take it further, some people are saying, your proposed works are going to detract from resident enjoyment of the river and of their properties by obstructing views, by allowing the public to look into their properties, by affecting their outbuildings, their landscaping, their plantings, and so forth. Is that anticipated to be a major issue? And they're also wondering, if you do have those kinds of impacts, how will property owners be compensated?
I think, you know, those are all very individual kinds of impacts on a property by property basis. So, you know, there may be a shed or a garden bed or a tree that's particularly important to a particular property owner or homeowner. And, you know, that discussion would have to happen, I think, on an individual basis, is how best that can be addressed.
Thank you. We've been talking about the impact on sort of residences and property owners. There are also a number of people who are interested in the impact on recreational users of the river. So somebody has asked, what will be the impact of your proposed changes on recreational access to the rivers, whether that be from rafting operators with launches on the rivers in the areas that you're looking at, or people with their own watercraft who want to launch them, or people who need, with disabilities who need easy access to the rivers and so forth. And they're wondering, how will your changes affect the current level of safe and convenient access, and how will you ensure that that's maintained?
I think the two boat launch or canoe launch locations are relatively unaffected. Rob, it's the one north of William Street on the west side of Grand. Like, there's nothing at all proposed in that area. And then the other location by Penman's, by the dam, is, it would be relatively similar to what's there today. And I think there's an informal access, on the Nith, just upstream of the bridge, that's got some rickety stairs that go down there. But I don't know if there's an intention to formalize that through another program or not. But
Chris, I think you're correct about the two on the Grand, and you're right. I think that the one on the Nith is sort of a informal one now that we'll have to have further discussion as that design goes forward.
So Chris and Rob and others, some people are saying that what's being proposed is very vague and lacking in specifics. And they're wondering where the greater detail is, and what greater detail is required to make a more informed decision about the project. And they're even wondering whether the team can make available any three-dimensional concept renderings to help illustrate the proposed actions and mitigation features. So first of all, how do you respond to that notion that what's being proposed is vague and lacking in detail? And where can that detail be found?
I think,
Chris, perhaps I should answer this, Chris. So what we're doing here is we're doing a Class CA and a master plan. So we're never going to have drawings that are engineering drawings to construct the final project. That's just the way this works. You work through the process, you make decisions, you decide what the project you're going to implement would be and what the standards to which it's going to be designed. And then you go forward with the design to actually design it. When those details are available, and we have details as to how each property are affected, whether or not there's easement or property issues that have to be dealt with, or trespass issues, any number of things, they'll be dealt with at that time. But at this time, it's not possible to have all the engineering done to know every detail of every impact. We're looking at a master plan to decide the height of the protection, how it all fits together, and a priority ranking for how we're going to go about those projects. So that is all detailed in the report and has been held out at the meetings that we've had and will be in the final report. Chris, if you want to add into that.
Thanks, Rob. I think you covered it well. The only thing to add would be that Class EA process for the master plan takes us to a certain point with respect to the preferred alternative and the level of service and the feasibility. We're taking the Riverside buildings, that GW2, to the next level with the Schedule C So there will be additional details associated with that, but not through the master plan that we're proposing to complete now.
And Chris, are there any three-dimensional concept renderings available? Somebody was asking that. You're shaking your head no?
No.
Okay. And another question for construction along N1, so area N1, will an archaeologist be on site to deal with any pottery fragments or other things from the Aaron site?
There has been a stage 1 archaeological study completed as part of the EA. So that covers the whole study area from 20,000 feet. A recommendation of that study, or a finding of that study, is identified areas with potential for archaeological features or artifacts. And as work is refined and the footprint of impact is refined, the need for more detailed and stage 2 or even stage 3 archaeology will be triggered through the detailed design. So if there is potential, and there is potential for archaeological features in many of the areas, then there will be further investigations.
Okay, let's see if we can shoehorn in some more questions in the next 10 minutes or so before we hand things to Rob to talk about next steps and then draw things to a close around 8. And again, I just want to thank everybody for your on-point questions. They're very thoughtful, very purposeful, and much appreciated. So somebody is asking if you can provide a little more detail about what happens in the Schedule C for GW2, so for the Schedule C environmental assessment. How long does the process normally take? What are some of the significant steps that it will entail, and so forth? And I don't know if that's Rob or Chris, who would like to kick us off on that one?
I'd be glad to. So during this Schedule C, we'll be looking at more detail at that project. And when you're doing a master plan, it's hard to get into the details of every nook and cranny of the project. But in this scenario, we'll be looking more substantively on what some of the structural issues are out there, what some of the aesthetic issues of building it would be, and the environmental issues of building it as well. How it will work with the existing buildings. It's certainly a complicated project. There's no doubt about that. From design, financiers. I see there's a question on financing here too, and I'm glad to answer that one. If not that I have answers for it, but I have partial answers for it. But those details will all be looked at and dealt with. And the interesting thing about that project is that it's sort of close to an all or nothing. You can't just do it individually. You need to do it in portions. And certainly there's one portion where there's likely to be a developer handle it if the development goes ahead. But on the rest of it, we'll have to either do it for all the buildings or none of the buildings, really. It sort of is an all or nothing. So we need to work on how that's going to fit together. Chris, be glad for any help that you have in answering that too.
I can jump in if that helps. The Schedule C piece follows very much very similar pattern to what we've done with the Schedule E. We'll develop alternatives to mitigate the flood risk, and we'll evaluate those alternatives. We'll present those alternatives. We'll refine them. We'll basically do what Rob says. We'll dig into the details on the alternatives and give us just a little bit more information on the specifics. And in this case, because it's a complicated project and because it's interlinked with many users along that side of the river, we felt like it needed more study, and that there were more places that we could take it. It allows us a little bit more, another round of public consultation through that process. It's very well laid out in the EA documentation about how we develop that. So it is a structured piece, and we'll be following it. But it does allow us to develop the details, look at alternatives, get input, work through some of the questions that have been raised here with that specific project. So it'll be solely focused on that west side of the Grand.
Thanks, Jeff. So let's get Rob back in, and I'll ask all of our responders to please be as concise as possible so that we can get to as many questions as possible in the amount of time we have left. Rob, somebody's asking, are there any costs associated with the planned works that will be paid by the property owner that's fronting the river? Rob, you're muted.
Sorry, I forgot to put myself on mute after answering the last question. We don't have a direct answer for that yet. And as we go forward, and GW2 is a particular one where that is a question that has to be answered. Clearly, probably none of these projects are going forward without some federal and provincial funding. Almost all projects of this magnitude in Canada have that funding associated with them because of this, this is extreme. I think we're talking upwards of $20 million here to do everything. So we'll be looking for that, and how the property taxes and or other funding mechanisms, whereas we're potentially in some of these options actually fixing up structural issues which already exist on those properties. That has not been decided or discussed yet.
And somebody's wondering, once they're completed, so the works that you're proposing, who will be responsible for their maintenance and who will own them? So whether it's a cantilever wall or other things that you're doing, who's in charge of maintenance and who owns them?
Well, I think the answer to that for most of the works would be the county. So what's proposed is the cantilever wall would be constructed by the county on county property or easements, and is most likely to be the responsibility of the county. Where it gets more, where there possibly could be cost sharing, might be with things that would happen on the business walls that as we're doing those, but there's been no decisions made on that. There certainly are examples of where there was cost sharing on projects like that, but no decisions have been made on that. That would be ferreted out through the Schedule C.
And there's a planning policy related question. Someone is asking, with these proposed works or planned works to increase flood protection measures in downtown Paris, will there be changes to the special policy area to allow for additional residential units above the first floor commercial that's in the floodplain? Chris, is that something you can address? I know it's more of a policy planner question, but.
I think, the simple answer is that the works is to deal with the special policy area that we have in place right now. It's not, we're not upgrading it or reinforcing it to facilitate development that's permitted within that SPA framework.
And Chris, somebody's asking a very blunt and direct question, not that these others weren't, but they're saying, how confident are you that the work required to implement the proposed flood control measures won't end up causing more harm than good? And, there's worries about soil removal and erosion and impacts to the riverbed and so forth, and drilling. There's concern about the damage those things might cause as you put the mitigation measures in place. So how concerned are you? How confident are you that this can be done properly?
There's the construction impact, which would need to be mitigated, with various timing windows and appropriate methodology. We're very confident that can be undertaken in such a way that it's no long-term impacts. There'll be a temporary impact for sure. From a flood perspective and an erosion of the banks, from an erosion piece, what is proposed within that preferred alternative doesn't change the frequent flows that the river sees and that behavior around those frequent flows, which are typical for creating erosion or forming the bank or moving sediment and material in and around the banks. So that will continue to behave as it does today. When we raise the flood protection up and we increase that level of protection, there's a very small band where we go from today's level of protection to the proposed 100-year, where we're confining that flood event or that sort of range of flood events to within the existing floodway, rather than allowing it to overtop onto the floodway or to the floodplain. That impact, while in theory could have an adverse effect is so negligible and insignificant relative to the whole Grand River floodplain and what's upstream and downstream that it's not even measurable. So we're confident that what we're doing here is there's a clear benefit and no risk from that perspective.
Okay. And Chris, someone is wondering how the timeline for each recommended sub-project was determined. So how did you figure out the sequencing and the timeline for those initiatives?
So there's a prioritization table. It's on one of the slides in the presentation material if someone wants to go back and review that. But it was a 3 criteria factor, flood impact. So flood impact prevented. So it's looking at, the lowest elevation of the dike that's going to provide the greatest benefit. So it's tightening the flood protection up from the lowest point and working up from there. There was also the condition component. So if it was structurally unsound or requiring a significant amount of maintenance, that contributed to it as well. And then what was it protecting? So was it the flats? Was it downtown? Like how did it interact with the rest of the flood protection works and the timing of that? And that's all laid out it's summarized in the slides, and it will be laid out in that project file report when it's screened.
And someone is asking or saying that they were told that, or by the county, that this initiative was being undertaken now because there was provincial funding. Is that the case, or has something changed? Rob, did you want to jump in? Go ahead.
Yeah, the provincial funding did allow the project to go ahead with and decrease the cost of the taxpayers in Brant County because of it. So that's one of the reasons that this project has gone ahead. But through the evaluation of the condition of the structures and whatever, it's obvious that there are some works which need to be undertaken even to maintain the structures as they exist. So yes, we did take advantage of the federal funding for this, and that is one of the reasons why this is going on. But there has been federal funding for projects like this for a period of time, and we get the inkling that they will consider. Every year we hear of the issues that have happened across the country, which reinforce the fact that these projects need to be considered in numerous locations across the country.
So I know we're starting to bump up against 8 o'clock. I'm just going to make an executive decision to extend the meeting at least by 10 minutes or so that we can get a few more questions in, because I know there's quite a few here. And they will be posted on the website, but I think if we can hear some of the verbal answers, that would be great. So again, if we can go as quickly as possible, I'd appreciate that. Somebody is asking, have there been any expropriations or purchases of property that have already taken place or been negotiated or finalized? Has any of that happened yet? Rob, go ahead, please.
Glenn, there hasn't been a lot of that happening, but anything to do with expropriations or purchases of individual pieces of property, we do not discuss in public meetings. And so that, I think we'll leave it at that. I think there are a couple of landowners where there have been some discussions, and some of them have gone on for a period of time even before this. So we'll leave it at that.
Okay. And let's go back to Chris. Somebody's asking, is the county or the team concerned that all of the recent developments and the future developments that are coming, will they increase the likelihood of a 100-year flood event?
And no, the 100, so development within Paris, within the floodplain, is that going to increase the likelihood of a 100-year event across the Grand River watershed? No, that will occur as a combination of many different factors.
And somebody has asked if, or not if, but where were the boreholes drilled on the Nith River banks? Do you have that information handy? It's very specific in nature.
So there were all kinds of boreholes that and data that was available historically from many different projects that were able to be reviewed as part of the condition assessment is when those holes were dug. And some of them might have been associated with the recent work at the bridge at Mechanic Street. So various developments, any county work. So there was I guess a library of boreholes that we drew upon, and then there were some additional boreholes that were dug. The exact location of the additional boreholes, off the top of my head, I can't say, definitively. But we drew upon a wide variety of data.
And coming back to the question of access to data and information, someone is asking, why haven't we been given access to the justification for the initiative, that is the scientific reports? So can anybody speak to that, please?
I think results have been provided in meetings so far. So there's been snapshots and information that has led us to the conclusions that we've made and the justification. So that's no secret, and that's being presented at previous meetings, and those slides are still available. And then there'll be more details. If people have requested more details, we're happy to have those discussions. And also there will be a lot more details in the project file report as well. Okay.
And another question, and I don't know if Rob or Chris or Jeff, whoever wants to handle this one, it's very specific about the materials and the approaches. Someone has said the plan is to replace the cages and put armor stone in, but the armor stone that they have seen is failing upriver. The cages near this person's house have not lost any rock. How can you guarantee that the armor stone won't fall or fail, rather, like it did up by the northern footbridge? So any thoughts about the technique of using armor stone versus the caged rock, so to speak?
Maybe Jeff?
Sure, I can. The installation upstream of the bridge, I think we've seen some loss of materials behind the stone and some failures in that. The strategy down here would be a little bit different, and the armor stone, we replace gabion stones in river channels quite frequently with armor stone. Basically the number one reason being the life cycle of armor stone and the life cycle of an armor stone wall compared to the gabion baskets. The gabion baskets, even when they're galvanized, have a lifespan of 25 to 30 years before we see them start to, and sometimes even less, but before we see them start to rust and corrode and break apart. And then it's only a matter of time when that failure of the cage happens, when we start to lose the rock. And once we lose the rock, we lose the structural element of the wall. And it typically happens at the waterline, which means we lose the rock at the bottom of the wall, which means we lose the foundation of the wall. And the wall after that becomes unstable and either tips or pulls off the bank or separates from the remaining wall. And armor stone doesn't do that. We build it like we build, like the bricks on a house. We overlap them and stack them, and we put them together. We make sure that the foundation is solid. In this case, there's some shale to found it on, and we build a retaining wall based on the geotechnical information and the information we have. Flood. We look at scour. We look at the hydraulics and the pressures on the wall, and we put them in place, and typically to last much longer than the gabions that are there.
Okay, so let me jump in. Just a couple more questions. And again, we want to be respectful of people's time, and then we'll look to wrap things up. Another path-related question, and Chris, maybe this one goes to you. Somebody is asking, will the public be allowed on the path for N1, for section N1?
That's the section from River Street or Grand River Street across where there's the cenotaph and that sort of parking lot. Is that the section that, I mean, you can't ask the person who asked the question. I'm assuming that's the section that they're referring to. I believe that there is a separate county project that's looking at pathways and access through there. And I know that it's like an informal where it's through private property and where it's advantageous to negotiate a pathway through there, that may be possible. But I think there's, the intent of this project isn't necessarily to encourage that, but I think there's a separate project that's going on to looking at that pathway.
Yeah. And one more, Rob, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm going to anticipate that on this project that it's West River Street from the Mechanic Street footbridge to the north is where they're concerned about it. And I don't believe that there's an intent to do it in that area. Down south of there, adjacent to Wincy Mills and some of those other things, I think that's where they're talking about the potential of this happening. And there probably is some potential down there because there is more public space down there. There isn't just much private residences. So I think that's where the dividing point would be.
Yeah, absolutely. North of Mechanic Street Bridge or upstream of Mechanic Street Bridge, there's no intent for public access.
Okay, so just quickly, what about the footbridge? Somebody has asked, why does the footbridge need to be raised 3 feet? Are you proposing to do that? And if so, why?
Because it's a hydraulic control structure. So like that raises the flood level behind it. So it needs to be raised so that it conveys the 100-year underneath it. It's too low.
Okay. And Rob, let me give this question to you. Somebody has asked, how long do easements typically last? And when there is an easement on one's property, does that result in a reduced property value typically?
There's when you register an easement, there's different types of easements, and easements between between properties, they usually last 21 years less a day, but easements with municipalities are in perpetuity. And they're registered and barred. And do they reduce property value? It depends. There's properties here where it may increase the property value because they are subject to substantial damage because of the flooding potential, where there could be there's potential when there's municipal easements of property being devalued. There's potential of the property being increased.
Thanks, Rob. So thank you everyone for giving us an extra 10 minutes of your time. Just before I invite Rob Walton to come back and quickly recap and talk about next steps and share any final observations he might have, I wanted to thank you again for participating. A special thank you to those who shared questions and comments either before the meeting or during the meeting. I know we didn't quite get to all of them, but be assured again that staff will be posting questions and responses on the county's website. Also wanted to thank all of our elected officials again for joining us this evening, both for their interest in the topic, but more than that, for their ongoing and very important and valued service to the community. And from my perspective, it's been a pleasure facilitating this meeting with a group that is very thoughtful and knowledgeable. And thank you again for the on-point and very purposeful and direct and straightforward questions. So just before I come back to draw things to a close, over to you, Rob, to talk a little bit about next steps and where things go from here.
Thanks, Glenn. First of all, I'd like to say that at the first of the Q&A, there's a few, and I answered most of these, but there's a few, I'd say that they're relatively straightforward to answer questions that we did answer on there. The ones that we didn't get answered on there, we will try and answer those as a team afterwards and get either directly to those people where it's questions we should answer directly to them, or on the Q&A, which we'll post on the website afterwards. So you can't imagine until you do one of these meetings, there is time pressure here as to what you're doing or whatever. And I was doing my best to answer some of those easy ones to get them out of the way and let people know what's going on. When we started to get ready for the other Q&A here, you can't keep doing that. So that will happen. We will accept for the next 2 weeks. We will accept any emails that are coming into us as input before we finalize the report. So we'll post that as part of the information from this meeting as well. So on the website, Engage Brant, you'll have the people you can get a hold of there, and either to have ask direct questions and talk to, or to put in input for the report. So we will do that. After that, what will happen is the project team will be finalizing and discussing those comments, and Ecosystems Recovery will be finalizing their project file for the Schedule B Class EA, to which then they'll present back to staff, and there will be a staff report to council. I'm going to assume it's going to be in sometime September, October of this year would be the earliest that you would ever see that. And then once that's, if council accepts that, it'll go on the public record for a 30-day review period, to which time anybody can make further comments on that. So after that, we've committed to doing the Schedule C project for the west side of the Grand River, adjacent to the downtown buildings. So there's going to be lots more discussion there. And even on the other projects, where as we go ahead and do final drawings, where there is direct property concerns of us either needing easements or property issues, or things that are possible trespass issues and the like, we will be going out to owners on those, and there clearly will be a pre-construction meeting held, which would be advertised to the directly adjacent owners and the community when any projects go ahead. So there's going to be several points of contact on all of these projects before anything happens. I know somebody asked when the earliest when project could be, and that would be, I think some of the people in behind the scenes I'm talking about that said 2022. I think that's probably highly unlikely. We don't even have any funding from the federal and provincial government for any of these. So when that would happen, I don't know, but it's probably likely after 2022, which is not really that far away when you think about it. So I would say get your comments in the next 2 weeks. Look for that meeting where we consider the report, and I would anticipate we would advertise that through Engage Brand. If you keep following the page on Engage Brand for this, we would be advertising when we know that report will be going forward. And yeah, the project team is willing to talk to anyone through email or direct discussions where that's what's required to get this done. And I'm glad to see the turnout tonight. There's 58 participants as I'm talking right now. We held 2 meetings to which we did direct mailings to a lot of people, and we got between 5 and 10 people at those to the first 2. So other than staff, 5 or 10 people in the public. So it's really good to see increased participation here, and that'll get us to hopefully to a better project as we go forward. So thanks, Glenn. I think that's all I've got to say.
Great. Thank you very much, Rob. And thank you again to all of the various personnel who made this session possible. Thank you to all of our attendees for your participation. I'll just note to the technical team, make sure that you save the questions that have come in through the Q&A function. We want to make sure that those are not lost. And to everyone else, I'll invite you to enjoy the rest of the evening. And I'll now formally adjourn the session. Take care and stay safe. And good night, everyone.